When all of Florida went under, being that it was already sea level, the world woke up, but it was much too late. A year later, every coastal city in the world had been inundated, for water always finds its way in. Northern Canada, along with its eastern and western sections, was no more. Only the now more temperate interior remained dry, it filling up with more and more people and tropical birds by the day. Cynthia had moved to the cabin, for Lake Ontario was acting up. A small portion of Siberia was usable too for now, and an iffy part of Argentina. Alaska was gone to its mountains, as were Central and Latin America and Mexico. The heat was melting the ice caps. The equatorial regions had become unbearable, the temperatures now reaching 135 degrees F. Most of these people really had no place to go. The pace of the disaster was startling, exceeding even the grimmest of predictions. Australia's population, being mostly coastal, had retreated to the thin edge between its useless interior and the deep blue sea. Greybeard was holding on, being one who was acclimated to extremes, as well as to living off the land. He'd climbed a sturdy tree when the tidal wave swept inland, perching there for a day, until the waters had receded enough for him to slog his way home. His tiny car with its 2-horsepower engine had been washed away, but he still had the big one at home. His ranch was soggy but otherwise secure. The great inland sea reappeared, then evaporated, and then returned. Meteorology had become a fruitless science. Summer was now year-round. He readied his camping gear just in case. The Yukon was a mess too, yet Label Wench as well was a survivor. The dogs had been leashed, the sled provisioned. Cars could not brave the mud and the slush, so she was off on the ultimate Yukon quest, with her sled and dogs. Whitehorse was dying. Prof Pat was fine where he was, although the Great Lakes were enlarging even with their locks having been closed, for the water runneth over. All this from a Bindu dot, he thought. Resistance was futile, for water was slippery stuff, its tiny hydrogen atoms easily rolling around the oxygen. Various schemes and solutions had been endlessly debated, most of them being as tough on mankind as the heat, the rest of them unattainable. It was all happening much too quickly. The estimates had been way off. Nature was now a dragon, and she had roared and was spewing her fiery breath upon her own fragile planet.
Some tried to live in basements, but the heat found them. Some dug underground, but the floods came. Many near extinctions had happened before, one being only 74,000 years ago when, at Toba in northern Sumatra, a supervolcano erupted. 6 years of volcanic winter followed this eruption, bringing pre-humans to the very edge of elimination. There were but a few thousand of them left around, since very little light could reach the dusty ground. It took 20,000 years for them to recompose from the cauldron of fire that had almost brewed humanity away. It was from this handful of hardy souls that we modern humans arose. Back to the heat. Due to the intense global warming and ice melting that was about to reach a runaway exponential point, the weather patterns had been greatly altered and were bringing numerous and severe storms all over the globe, causing much interior flooding, plus wiping out most of the crops. The rate of destruction was becoming astronomical. No one could keep up with it. It was everyone for themselves. 2012 had long since passed without incident, and now it was 2024. Millions had perished in a matter of a few weeks, and there was little government infrastructure working save for the covert ninja empire. However, humans were hardly a match for nature gone wild. It could and would only get worse unto the end. Back in 1960, Bob Christensen had looked around everywhere at the Yellowstone National Park grounds for its volcanic caldera but had found it nowhere. By some coincidence, NASA had photos from a recently tested high-altitude camera. Astounded, Bob learned why he failed to spot the caldera. It was virtually the entire park, 2.2 million acres of area. Yellowstone must have blown up with a violent misery far beyond anything known throughout our history. The crater was 40 miles across. There was also a huge gap in the mountain chain. The cataclysm had been even beyond the scale of what imaginations could have dreamt up. It had thousands of times more monstrous molten fire than Mount St. Helens. Krakatoa was but a firecracker in comparison. Yellowstone's eruptions average one really massive blow every 600,000 years, the last one 630,000 years ago. So it was long overdue and perhaps pending, but still, that could be thousands of years off. The ninja leaders and their teams flew into Nihao on their last tanks of gas, there to take sanctuary and a vote for a desperate but uncertain plan. The landing strip now had quite a tricky slope to it. Many near extinctions had occurred before, but none in modern times. However, death seemed to be a way of life throughout history. Of all extinctions, the Permian was the largest, happening 245 million years ago, when 95% of species perished, suddenly disappearing from the fossil recording. Life had almost come to a total obliterationing. That we are even here was due to the dinosaurs and 90% of all the species being wiped out. A small and nervous, shrew-like creature looked out. The dinosaurs, the forever kings of the earth, were gone. The shrews attached to a favorable evolutionary line. Every single one of our forebears on both sides survived, they being attractive enough to locate a loving mate with whom they're loved to celebrate.
In the late 1700s, Cuvier could take heaps of bones and whip them into shapely forms not in the stones. After for the first time a theory on extinction, in which some groups of creatures became history. This raised uncomfortable implications at the time. Why would God create and destroy without reason or rhyme? This suggested an unaccountable casualness by someone unseen chain of being, which held that the world was carefully ordered for us, and that every living thing thus had a place, and fossils in rocks to find the relative rock ages that were possible. At every change in rock strata, certain fossils vanished, while in others they carried on into subsequent levels. Was extinct not only occasionally but repeatedly. Right hostile distinction, more than the biblical Noachian deluge distinction's extinction. Of course, now we see nature more for what it is. Back to the future. It no longer mattered that humans were on a one-way trip from the quantum fluke.
On Nihao, Frederick walked the last mile. The world's roulette wheel was rolling 00 on what might soon be the last perfect day on Earth. And a hurricane was headed in his direction. Tsunamis washed deeper and deeper inland. Most of the internet no longer functioned. ToeQuest and Avoid were gone, their archives destroyed. Nobody had returned, his efforts at changing the future having been unsuccessful. Robert gave up his dreams of the toe. The toe center on Oahu had closed. Graham finally levitated up into the air, his new refuge above the clouds. Trish #1 East energized her way to the Forbidden Island. The top dragon, Old Rascal, as #1 West, awaited them all. A rainbow appeared as the spirit of Old Grandmaster West, flying through past them as the scent on the breeze and the courage to act. The votes had been counted. Rascal had now engaged the last working silo. Trish keyed in the codes and nodded to him, saying, "Would you like to do the honors?" "Yes, for unto me falls life's last duty. Nature will now have to contend with herself. It will be fire versus ice, dragon against dragon, just as shown by the picture on the Great Wall. However, this could well be the end for all of us." "Or not if it works," she answered. "Or global warming will be defeated by the worldwide dust in the atmosphere. The years will tell. It is our only hope." Rascal pressed the button. Nuclear missiles were being fired deep into the heart of the Yellowstone caldera. At least 5 surrounding states and 2 Canadian provinces would be completely destroyed. Yet, winter would come, probably bringing its own array of problems. But then, after that, could spring be far behind?